Lallemont Brewing, and I will be your host today. As you know, biotransformation in beer, and in particular the biotransformation of hop compounds by yeast, is an ongoing hot topic in the brewing industry. And we have done quite some work on this. For instance, we have done a project with Tom Shellhammer at Oregon State University and Laurent Dagan from Nyséos, who's presenting today. And we looked at the influence of yeast and enzymes on the hoppy aromas in beer. There we screened our different yeasts and different beta-glucosidase formulations to see the impacts on terpenes mainly, but also on thiols. And Tom will present these results at the WBC on Thursday, October the 1st, online, obviously. But it's worthwhile to log into that. And we have created two best practice sheets based on these results. One is called IPA solutions, and the other one is called biotransformation. Both of them are available on our website if you're interested. So while a lot of work actually has been done and published on terpenes, there is less information available on thiols. We have done some initial screening of our strains for beta-lyase activity. So we looked at the gene expression and growth in selective media. And we also plan to continue our project with OSU and Nyséos to focus this time on beta-lyase activity. And one of the reasons that there's not a lot of information on thiols is, in beer in particular, is that it's a very complicated analysis of the thiols, but also of its precursors. So we're very happy that Laurent Dagan is with us today. He's the co-founder and CEO of Nyséos. This is a private company offering commercial analysis. Laurent himself is an expert on the analysis of aroma compounds, mainly on the focus on thiols. He has done extensive work on aroma compounds in wine and recently extended his research to beer as well. And he has presented his findings at ASBC and EBC. So today he's talking about aroma potential of hops and malts. Laurent, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Thomas, for this kind introduction, and hi, everyone. It's not very easy to don't have the opportunity to see everyone, but I'm happy to be there today to talk about aroma potential. So the goal of this presentation is to give you an overview on different aroma potential to have a general knowledge about this topic, because research is running a lot on this topic and we don't have all the answer to all the question. So I know what happens when you are listening a web conference. You can read your email, you can talk to your friends or colleagues, but as my English is very poor and my accent is very French, you really need to focus on your screen to try to understand, I hope, an half of all this information. So let's go. I will start with a brief information about the concept of aroma and aroma potential. And I will share different information about two different topics: thiol and thiol precursors, what happened in raw material and in beers through different experiments. And the second topic is about dimethyl sulfide potential. So this is a topic that brewers know very well, but there is some new information in hops. And I will conclude with just about the next question that we have to answer. And I'm not alone to do that, and many teams are working on this topic. So when I talk, especially with English people about precursors, most of the time nobody understands precursors because my accent, but I have to give you information about this concept. A precursors is just most of the time an odorless molecule, a big molecule, which is able to release some volatile compounds, some aroma compounds, especially during process in beverage production. This is an interesting concept because it's the idea to manage the aroma before to have volatile compound, so to manage the aroma potential from the raw material. So there is two different points about aroma. First one is an aroma compound. It's just one molecule, volatile, able to go from the liquid of the beverage to the atmosphere, and this molecule is able to bring some flavor. The global aroma is just a combination of all these molecules to give some or sometimes just one aroma notes. So often we can say that aroma is something complex, and it's really true. I think that analytical method acknowledge it's just a part of very precise information, and it's really difficult to have a real view of what is an aroma. So a lot, really many aroma compounds in the different beverage, and it's true for beer and it's true for wine. And the strategy in research is to focus most of the time on key aroma compounds. Without this key aroma compound, your beer profile, your wine profile will change a lot. You can lose typicity, you can lose intensity, and the challenge is to try to better control this key aroma compound. So many molecules with many different chemical structure, so with many different aroma threshold, perception threshold. All these molecules can be found at different concentration, at trace level, around nanogram per liter until milligram, 100 of milligram per liter. And to improve complexity, all these molecules can interact. They can create interaction to create synergy or mask effect. So, to be honest, here's something very complex. So to start on Thiols topic, I think the beginning is these three Thiols, the 4-MMP, the 3-MH, and the 3-MHA. There is different abbreviation, different name, not easy to follow, but I let you some information at the end of this document. This molecule have been discovered in Sauvignon Blanc wine more than 30 years ago. And the specificity of this molecule is the very low perception threshold, similar in wine and beer, around nanogram or tenths of nanogram per liter. And a molecule with a very few amount, you can have very interesting odorant notes in the beer and in the wines. The second important information is that two of these three thiols, the 3-MH and the 4-MMP, exist in the raw material under the form of different precursors. Most of them are odorless precursors. It's peptides and cysteine derivatives. So there is many different precursors which have been discovered even recently. And I won't go deeper on the structure, just to keep in mind that there is no odor with this molecule. And the second pathway of 3-MH is possible through some some carbonyl compounds, unsaturated carbonyl compounds, for the 3 image, especially the hexanol. It's another way. I will discuss about that later. So to give you an overview about, to try to understand the origin of thiol in wine, even if we don't have all the information. First, we have these different precursors in grapes and in the must. And some pre-fermentative step can influence the concentration of some of these precursors. And the key step is fermentation, where a yeast is able to transform these different precursors into volatile thiols. The yield is most of the time around 1%. It's very low, but you have a big amount of precursors in the must, and we just need small amount of thiols in wine to have a sensorial contribution. The part of precursors is not completely elucidated. We just have a part of the information, and more precursors probably exist. And we are able to explain 3SH concentration in wine. It represents just 50% of the precursors we have. So a part is not well understood. And the other point, very important, is that these thiols are very sensitive to oxidation. And after the release during fermentation and during aging, this molecule can be oxidized in different molecules. So after more than 30 years of research and experimentation, winemakers are able to play with different parameters all along the process to manage, and sometimes just to try to manage, because it's a little bit tricky. So to manage this thiol in the wine. So vine variety, maturity, nitrogen foliar spraying are different strategy, different choice you can do at the beginning of the process. During pre-fermentative step, oxidation management, some metabolite as glutathione, hydroxycinnamic acid are very important to limit the future oxidation. Different processes are possible to improve extraction of the precursor from the skin of the berry, or to improve precursors. We need to avoid some metals, especially copper, which are very reactive with the future thiols. During fermentation, nutrition and the choice of the yeast strain is very important, and the relation between nutrition and specific yeast strain is a good strategy to improve the release of thiol, and probably it's the step which has been the most studied on this topic. And for sure, temperature and antioxidant metabolite are important to preserve this thiol against oxidation until aging. And all operations during bottling are very important too. So on this graph, you just can see different family of aroma compounds in different commercial IPA. And you can see orange and yellow bar about thiols, and you can see that there is a big difference depending on the beer, and that these compounds are really present in different commercial beer, and they contribute to the aroma of the beer in relation with other family of aroma compounds. In a similar study, our first study in commercial beer show that there is sometimes big difference in Thiol concentration in different beer on the market. And the question we had at this time was to understand if the origin of Thiol is just an extraction of free Thiol in hops, or if it was a release of Thiol during fermentation from precursors. So this knowledge was at this time very clear in wine, but it was not so clear at this time in brewing. So at the same time, in the same project, we analyzed 3MH in different hop samples, and you can see some difference, concentration around tenths of microgram per kilogram of hops, and you can see some difference with high amount of Thiols in cascade, but no conclusion about hops variety because our background on hops variety is not so huge. Just to understand that free Thiol exists in hops, and if you use hops, especially during dry hopping, you can just extract this aroma in the beer. On the same hop samples, we analyze different 3MH precursors, and you can see first that the concentration is 100 times more important until 1000 times. So precursors are really abundant in hops, and you can see that many different in hops variety and no relation between the free form of Thiols and the bounded form of Thiols. So we use hops, brewers use hops to extract aroma in the beer, and you are able to smell that. It's very clear with passion fruit note, for example. But most part of Thiols are under the form of bounded odorless precursors. So how can we do to improve the release of Thiol from these precursors? This is a big question. So at this time, we tried to do some simulation depending on hop usage. We observe through discussion with brewers to understand if what we observe in the beer was just extraction or Thiol release during fermentation. So we did different simulation with dry hopping at 1 gram per liter, and you can see the blue bar. We can explain just a part of free Thiol in this different commercial beer. If you increase dry hopping, you can explain just a part again of aroma. If we do some simulation with extraction of precursors during boiling or during whirlpool hopping with 1% of yield by yeast activity during fermentation, you explain just a part, and you need to improve the amount of hops to be able to explain. So it's just hypothesis, but probably in brewing, some brewers are able to release Thiol from precursors, but it's most of the time today empiric approach. So in wine, researchers identified some different Thiols, but in hops, some other research identified really more Thiols. 41 Thiols have been identified in 2 hops varieties, Nelson Sauvin and Tomahawks. So hops is very rich in Thiols, and it opens new topics to understand what is the impact of all this molecule. But just a simulation from information in the literature show that most of the time concentration level of these thiols are too low to be found above perception threshold in the beer. So you need to use a big amount of hops with some limit sometimes. And the question of aroma potential for all these thiols is probably important. So I'll let you the list you can find in the literature, but I won't discuss this information. So in hops, what is interesting too is that there is many different unsaturated carbonyl compounds which can be used to create different precursors, and during fermentation all these precursors, that is a theory, could release all these different thiols. So in the literature all thiols have not been found in whole beer, but it's just good hypothesis, and yeast is a key point to do all this transformation. The first one from the precursors and the other transformation, so reduction and esterification, you can have during the fermentation too, to improve the diversity of thiol in the beers. Another information about malts. So everybody knows that malt doesn't taste passion fruit, but precursors exist at high concentration in some malt quality. So in this very short study, we show that probably ABC value is in relation with the amount of precursors, and the higher concentration have been found in some Pierce malt or with malt with very low ABC. Another very brief study with IFBAIM shows that during malting, we can improve the amount of the precursors of 3-MH. It's not true for all trials and all samples, but it's just the idea that we can change the aroma potential very soon in the process. So one slide to keep in mind is that in hops you have 3 thiols and different thiol precursors too. And in malt you just have the odorless precursors. And I won't present today an experiment we did with Houblons in Montpellier, but it's very interesting to evaluate the amount of each aroma compounds and precursors in the raw material in a specific recipe to evaluate what is a part of free aroma in your raw material and the global aroma potential in your recipe. And in this study, for this specific recipe, we observe that precursors in hops and in malt, depending on the amount of each raw material we use in this recipe, were very similar. So malt potential for thiol is very important too. So not easy to resume what happened during the brewing process, but in this slide you will find, and you will take the time to look, it's not a perfect scheme, but it gives an overview of the different pathways demonstrated in wines and in beer. It's a kind of combination to open mind and to think about what you can do in your process to improve precursors, odorless precursors, or to improve alkenyls and carbonyl, unsaturated carbonyl compounds with a different way. So what is difficult is that the two main pathways are connected, especially during fermentation. So it's complex for a researcher to really understand, but this is different key parameter you can play with to better understand how to improve thiol in beers. So the next step and the next challenge in brewing is to make some relation with what happens in winemaking, but with specific raw material, specific hop usage all along the process, what is so different compared to winemaking, and very specific process with heating steps. We have some information, but it's very brief. We know that during mashing, precursors can be changed, can be transformed. We know that we have a loss of precursors during boiling and a release of free thiol, but most part is oxidized. During alcoholic fermentation, there is some results about yeast, but not too much. Some works from Suntory, which compare bottom, so low temperature yeast strain and high temperature yeast strain with some differences, but everything is very new and not really consistent. But probably some yeast strain in brewing are really efficient to release thiol, and the quality of the wort is a big question to find the best couple between wort quality and yeast to improve this release. And the question of oxidation too is something very specific in brewing too. There is some information during bottle fermentation with some increase of thiol release with another pathway recently demonstrated. And the last strategy, which is not very efficient and probably a little bit tricky too, is to use external additional enzyme to do the job. So that's it for thiol. It's very long, but too much information. So next step is about DMS. I know that most of brewers doesn't like DMS. In wine, DMS has an ambiguous role, and sometimes it's an off-flavor. It's similar than in brewing, but sometimes, and in many different wine, depending on the concentration, DMS can improve fruity note for wine aroma, and it's something very interesting that has been demonstrated in red wine in Rhone Valley, in Bordeaux region, and in different white wine on the southwest region in France. So I think that all brewers know very well this scheme. Just to say that DMS is created during malting or during the heat step at brewhouse. And a part of DMS can be oxidized into DMSO, you know that. And during fermentation, you can have an increase of DMS, especially after reduction of DMSO. But if you work well, DMS and GMS potential, so PDMS and SMM, S-methyl methionine, so I will use SMM, are very low most of the time. This is the first information. So in wine, it's a little bit different because DMS is not so critical for wine, and you can have a potential in the bottle, and it's during wine aging that this potential will release the DMS after many years. So aging time is so different in wine, but just to keep in mind this idea, if you have a potential in the wine bottle, you will have, depending on the temperature, you will have DMS in your wine. After 2 years, you will have 20% of the potential that will be released, 50% after 8 years approximately. It's an idea. So why all this information? Because first we did a single observation 2 years ago. We tried to study DMS potential and SMM in a process, in a recipe at Houblons, and we observed that every time we added hops, we observe an increase of DMS potential. And we are not able to explain some difference between PDMS and SMM, which should be the same. But at the end of the process, we observe around 250 micrograms of DMS potential or SMM in the beer. And it's an high concentration. And the second observation has been done in a benchmark of different beer, commercial beers, especially 11 IPAs from US market, where we found important amount of PDMS and SMM too, average around 250 microgram for both parameter. And we observe in the same beer, it's a yellow bar, high concentration of DMS, around 70 microgram per liter. And some friends in brewing said to me, you have a problem with your analytical results. But I think that there is no problem with this result. And we suppose, it was our hypothesis, that hops was very important to increase this aroma potential. And on the right of the graph, you can see for other beers that the aroma potential is really lower compared to the hoppy beers. So it's not really a surprise because S-methylmethionine, which corresponds to the DMS potential in brewing, exists in whole plants, and it plays many different roles. So our hypothesis at this time was that if we had hops at different brewing steps, especially when temperature is low, we won't be able to destroy this potential, and it was possible to have a big amount of precursors in the bottle, and during aging it was possible, as in wine, as we observe in wine, to observe an important release of DMS, even if aging time in beer is really shorter. So we did different experiments to try to confirm this hypothesis, and I will present just a part to stay on time. And the first study was to measure SMM and DMS potential in different hop samples, 15 hop samples, where we found an average of 25 microgram equivalent dimethyl sulfide, DMS, equivalent DMS in the different hops. So it's important. And if we do some simulation with hopping rate for dry hopping at 10 grams per liter, you can see that you can have more than 270 micrograms of DMS potential in your beer if extraction is full. So there is big difference depending hops samples, with very low concentration and very high concentration. And on the right, on the graph on the right, you can see that there is a good correlation between PDMS and SMM. So I think that probably the measurement of DMS potential, it's an indirect analytical approach, is correct to measure SMM in hops. So we did two different experiments which consisted in addition of hops or specific SMM in different beer to evaluate if during aging we will improve the concentration of DMS. So we did a first experiment in a fast aging condition using 40 degrees temperature, which is not normal, during 70 days. And a second experiment in more classic aging condition. And the strategy was the same, control and different trial with different amount of hops, real hops, from the market, and different amount of the molecule of SMM. And we analyze DMS potential and SMM along the study. So the main results are on this graph. This is a fast aging experiment, but it's a good part of the conclusion. You can see on the right that between the T0 and 40 days, you have a decrease of the two different parameters of SMM and DMS potential and an increase of DMS. So this hypothesis is true. If you have this amount of precursors, you can improve the release of DMS. It's true for the dry hopping part of the experiment on the left. It's true when we just added SMM. And it's, you can see in comparison the control where we didn't found big amount of aroma precursors. And there is some difference, but you will see that what we measure as precursors corresponded to what we expected depending on the amount of hops or the amount of SMM spiked. This result have been show that there is no matrix effect. So there is a linear correlation between the percentage of release and the time of aging. So it's what we observe in wine. This matrix effect has been confirmed with different experiments. We use condition with oxygen, so the same experiment with oxygen and no difference in DMS creation and no influence on the right of the pH, variation of the pH. So the release is really in relation with temperature and time. So I think I'm just on time. This is, I won't discuss the beer standard aging. It's the same experiment with similar conclusion. So just to conclude about these two topics, I think that for Thiols, there is a huge reservoir of Thiol in hops and in malt, and we need to better understand how to optimize the release of these precursors. There is many hypotheses about pathway, but we have good information about two possible main pathway. Fermentation, as in wine, is probably a key step to release Thiol with different parameters as yeast strain and nutrient. So the quality of the wort is a big question, as and it was the same for the must in wine. So other metabolites can interact in the release, and knowledge is very small now. So for next topic, not for me, but for everyone we are interested in this topic, I think that origin in hops and cultivation influence is an interesting topic to better manage the hops quality about Thiols. Probably the future will bring new precursors, and probably there is a lot of many different precursors in hops. And so optimization, as I said, is probably the hot topic now. We are working on the role of different hop metabolites during fermentation to go in that way with the interaction between hops and yeast. So hops is something very rich with many different metabolites. SMM is exists as I talk about, glutathione, amino acid, and I think there is many metabolites we have to learn more to better learn about hop quality. About application, we can use that information. It's what we did with the brew to really select raw material depending on the recipe and the beer style you want to create. And this information about aroma and precursors are very useful to optimize a process. And about PDMS, the key information is that SMM exists in hops, but it's not really a problem, I think. Even if dry hopping can improve DMS during aging, maybe it's an opportunity to have a new regard on DMS. The part of the study I didn't present about the sensorial perception threshold of DMS in OP beers seems to be very high. So contribution is not a problem. It's not an off-flavor, but I suppose that this compound play an interesting role for OP beers. And we have to go deeper about the sensorial contribution of this molecule in beers. Another topic is as S-methylmethionine and DMS potential increase during harvest grapes, maybe this molecule can be an indicator for harvest in hops too. So it's another topic, possible topic with some future application. So I think it's interesting to evaluate DMS potential in hops because we saw that sometimes concentration can be very high. And it's an opportunity to optimize process as kilning and fermentation too, because SMM can be a nutrient for yeast. I think that this new knowledge will improve DMS management in beers. And some friends said me, you are true. We did some observation with some too high concentration of DMS in hoppy beers, and we didn't really understand why. And I really think that it's not dangerous, but it's reality in some commercial beer. So I think it's time. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was not too harsh to understand. And I let Tobias to follow.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Laurent. That was a very interesting presentation, and it shows there's still lots of work to do, and in particular for us in yeast as well. As you demonstrated, there's probably quite a bit of knowledge already on precursors and amounts available coming from hop and malt, but we still don't understand really completely what the different yeast strains can do, and how to screen effectively for basically the best yeast strain for thiol release, for instance. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the presentation that you have here ask a question button. So if you would put your questions in there, and then I'm going to read them to Laurent. And we got already a couple of questions. So there is Didier Theodore. He asked, what is the perception threshold of thiol in beer similar to white wine?
Yeah, perception threshold described in the literature are very similar. It's around 1 nanogram per liter for the 4-MMP and around 60 nanogram per liter for 3-SH and around some nanogram per liter for acetate. It's a little bit strange to have similar value because threshold is a very interesting information, and every day we have this type of question about perception threshold, but for us it's something sometimes dangerous because matrix effect can change a lot the perception threshold and you can have big difference, and it's the conclusion about DMS in hoppy beers with higher concentration and higher perception threshold in hoppy beers compared to lager. So be careful with perception threshold. But for Thiols, and to conclude about this question, just a trace level of this molecule can change the aroma of your beer.
Good. Thank you. Then we have a question from Leandro Miners. On the slide that you showed that the IPA had levels above those achievable from a 5 gram per liter dry hop, do you know the hopping, whirlpool, and dry hop quantities used? What about yeast strain? And if so, was there any correlation between a particular yeast strain and a higher level of thiols?
So many questions at the same time. It's not just one question.
So maybe start with the beginning. Yeah.
It was during dry hopping. I'm not sure about the slide, but when we did some experiment in the past, we did experimentation during dry hopping. Sometimes before fermentation, sometimes during fermentation, and sometimes at the end of the fermentation. So it's this time of addition is important, and that can change thiol release or thiol extraction. But in this presentation, I think it was just a simulation from the information we obtained on the different commercial beer and the different hops. It was not. It was just a simulation to evaluate if the concentration of free thiol in different hops was enough to explain high concentration in the beer. And the answer at this time, it was no. So probably during fermentation, yeast in some beer release thiol from precursors. And we didn't really do a study for different yeast strain. Sometimes for our intern experiment, we use some yeast strain in wine and in beer, and we are able to release this thiol. But I think there is a big difference in beer, and our small background is that the potential is very high in beer, but the concentration in the beer is really lower compared to the wine. So I think really we need to continue the work to optimize thiol release by different yeast strain in brewing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no, I agree, and that's part of the work that we plan to do.
Yeah.
There's an additional comment from Leandro. So he said, yes, I meant about the commercial beers. I was wondering if they had any idea on how those beers were made to help interpret results.
No.
Information on how
no, this is really the limit of this approach. And at the beginning of the presentation, Tobias said that we were expert on this topic. We are not really expert, to be honest, but we take some information to say that it's possible to balance aroma with this compound. And this study has been done on commercial beer we bought on the supermarket.
Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers your question. And we have another question from Leandro. You mentioned the oxygen as a factor affecting the amount of thiols in beer. For wanted tropical flavored thiols, 3MH and 3MMP, etc., is oxygen addition negative or positive? For example, studies have shown that 3MB onion aroma is increased when hot wort is aerated during whirlpool.
We didn't do some experiment for this question. I know that there is big difference in oxygen management between must in wine making and for wort in brewing. And this is an important point, because to maximize, to have the best condition of fermentation, oxygen is interesting in brewing, but sure, oxidation phenomenon might be negative for the future thiol that will be released during fermentation, but no real information about that. But keep in mind that after fermentation, thiols are very sensitive to oxidation, and I think it's more a question for aging or the type of material you will use for bottling, so cans or bottle or plastic bag, I don't know, and oxygen management when you fill these different bottle types.
Thank you. And the next one is coming from Brent Jordan. I always understood that DMS is not a good flavor to have in beer. Is this the cabbage flavor? When you say improve DMS, do you mean reduce the level or increase it? I guess.
The preliminary results that we obtained with the University of Oregon, it was a collaboration with Tom Schellhammer, show that the perception threshold of DMS in two different OPBs were around 300 microgram per liter, and no off flavor have been detected by the panel of people who tested the beer. So I really think that it's a new topic to learn more about DMS, but I'm sure that DMS is not so bad for this type of beer, and maybe we might have some results with fruity enhancement with this compound, as we found in wine.
Okay, so even an increase, it's beneficial, you said?
Yeah. Just 1 minute, but I'm listening to you. Just.
Okay.
So my battery is okay.
It's okay now. Good. So we can continue. The next question is from Enrico Preni. Because thiols are so volatile, how long will they stay in beer after that beer is bottled or canned? And which is, in your opinion, the best container to preserve the thiols?
No study, from my knowledge, no study about the impact of different type of bottle. We know that for wine, there is some interaction with aroma compounds, but not only with plastic material. I don't know, we can say scalping effect or this type of thing. But I think no study for beer. And all these aroma compounds are very volatile. A part is in the liquid and another part, depending on stirring, temperature, will go in the atmosphere, but it's a small part. Most of aroma, big part stay in the liquid is the reason why you can smell the aroma for a long time. There is some specificity with very, very volatile compound as DMS. DMS can disappear after a few minutes with low concentration if you stir a lot your beer or your wine. But your thiols in your glass, you can take your time to drink your beer. They are in your glass.
Okay, good. The next question is from Duran Montesel. According to your observation in past studies, what was the best time of addition of dry hops in terms of thiol release? Start, near end, or post fermentation?
So I think that if you want to improve thiol precursors in the wort, it's important to use hops before fermentation. It's probably one reason of whirlpool hop addition. You increase free thiol extraction, but there is a risk of oxidation because sometimes temperature is high, but you will improve precursors. I didn't have the time to present this type of work, but we have some results that show if you use hops during whirlpool, you will improve the amount of precursors. And more precursors you have in the same condition of wort quality or must quality with the same yeast, we can expect an increase of release. But you need to have a good condition of release during fermentation, and that is the big question. If you want to if the strategy is just to extract free aroma, you can put hops at the end of the fermentation and you just will have an extraction of the free thiol. It's very easy, it's fast, and I think it's a success of dry hopping. The challenge is really to use the both strategy because we observe small difference between some thiols, and it was not really the same between 3SH and 4-MeP.
Okay. Okay. And that seems the last one, again from Enrico Preni. It has been mentioned that to improve the release of bounded thiols, it is possible to use enzymes. Which ones? And how much could be the cost of these enzymes, and if it's worth the effort?
Nothing in the market about that. I think it's a big question for a long time, as you can use various enzymes during mashing to improve sugar content in your wort. It's not so easy, but it's an old strategy which is studied, and maybe in the future we will have some solution. But the main strategy used in wine today is the selection of the yeast and the nutrition and the quality of the mast.
Yeah, I don't know of any very effective beta lyase product out there either. I know that there is beta glucosidase, so this is something that can be used, and probably have something coming up. So this is the last question as far as I see. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and thank you, Laurent, for presenting. I think it was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
And as we all see, there's still lots of work to do, and I hope we can present more results and more findings in the future.
Yeah, I think it's true. There is a lot of work to do, and I really think that the interaction between laboratory and brewers will improve how we can use this data, because brewers, you have a part of knowledge, the empiric knowledge, to bring future answer to all your questions. So we just are here to open your mind with some interesting topic, I think, about aroma, but you will probably have the key to optimize everything in your brewery.
Good. Some nice final words. Good. So thank you very much, everybody, again, and see you next time.